everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for the MiniMed 670G system pivotal trial in the pediatric population 7 to 13 years of age. I couldn't be more excited to have the ability to share this data with you today and to also introduce my good friend, Dr. Kevin Kaiserman, who's a pediatric endocrinologist, and he's going to share some case studies with you. Let me introduce myself. First, I'm Fran Kaufman. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Medtronic Diabetes, and I am also a pediatric endocrinologist. Therefore, this data means the most to me, as I hope it does to all of you as well. On my first slide, I want to show you the journey we have taken at Medtronic Diabetes to get to the 670G system. We first started with our sensor-augmented pump platform, upon which we built the automation of insulin delivery. Of course, first we started with suspending insulin, first at a preset threshold that you decided with your patient, and then we went on to do the predictive low glucose suspend system. And along the way, we did studies, we collected evidence, we published manuscripts so that you could see the benefits of first the sensor augmented pump platform itself, then the automation of insulin delivery to suspend insulin to both mitigate as well as prevent low glucose values. But that's a little bit different than saying we can automate the delivery of insulin, the basal insulin delivery, which we have done in our MiniMed 670G system. So now we get to a system that is automating every 5 minutes basal insulin delivery based off the sensor glucose data, where the sensor glucose has been, where it's predicted to be in the future, how much insulin is on board, and how sensitive the patient is to that delivery of insulin. So we, as you all know, I hope, first did the study in adolescents and adults to show the value of this automation of insulin delivery, our hybrid closed-loop MiniMed 670G system, and now I'm going to report to you the results on our pediatric population. So this is the system. I hope you're all familiar with it, that you've had the opportunity to use it on some of your own patients or see some other evidence of the manuscripts or some of our other webinars or lectures. We've been busy kind of going around the world informing those about the data we have obtained that helps inform you whether you think this is the right device for your patient, and of course discussing the data with your patient themselves so they can make that decision with you. So it is a system, and at the core of this system is the MiniMed 670G insulin pump itself, our new pump platform. Then there's the Guardian Link 3 transmitter with the Guardian Sensor 3, and you can see the MARD, the mean absolute relative difference between the data obtained from the sensor and the reference value of the Yellowstone instrument, the YSI instrument, in the pediatric as well as the adult population. And I hope you appreciate that this MARD enables us to drive insulin delivery through the system, and that it is an acceptable MARD, and that the sensor is where it should be inside a system that automates insulin delivery. Of course, we have CareLink as well, and I show you that we have 2 new reports, and that these reports really give a lot of information for you and your patient. And for the first time, these reports actually have a past comparative data set that you can look at right compared to what you're seeing now. And I think that means a lot when the patient sees a comparison of what they were doing on manual mode or open loop insulin pump therapy compared to closed loop or our hybrid closed loop system. And then of course it's linked with the Contour NextLink 2.4 meter, all part of the system, all working together, and this is what the data build is around. So this is our study design. I think it's very important for you to understand this. It's the same study design that we used with the adolescents and adults. So the inclusion criteria for the children where they were between the ages of 7 and 13. We had 9 sites, 8 in the US, 1 in Israel. All of the subjects had type 1 diabetes and A1C less than 10%, and had been on pump therapy for 6 months or greater with or without CGM. And turns out in the pediatric population, 66% of them had been using CGM before. So on the right side of the slide, you can see the demographics of the children who were in our pivotal trial, and of course you can compare them to the adolescents and adults. So the mean age was 10.8, a relatively common duration of diabetes for the 10-year-old population of 5.6 years. Total daily dose, 0.8 unit per kilo, and the A1C mean was 7.9, so a relatively well-controlled population. The study was a 2-week run-in period, and during that time period, they were trained on using hybrid closed-loop system. And then at 7 days, they went into auto mode, and then we studied them for the 3 months of the study period. So this is the actual data itself. So 105 subjects completed the study, and they wore the sensor 95% of the time and were in auto mode almost 80% of the time. So that's a kind of data we're looking for, the kind of data we hope you'll be able to obtain with your patients who are going to use this in their regular home setting. During the study phase of about 10,000 patient days of exposure to the device, we had 0 episodes of diabetic ketoacidosis and 0 episodes of severe hypoglycemia. From the baseline A1C, the mean of 7.9, to the end of the study, the A1C reduced to 7.5. So we actually got that mean value at the target for this age group of 7.5 or below. The number of subjects who reached that target during the run-in period were 36%, and by the end of the study, were a little bit over half of the population. And then if we plot out the A1C, as you can see on the right side of this graph, you can see the baseline run-in in the blue compared to the now end of the study period in the orange, and a shift to the left, which means that the A1C improved. You can see particularly those in the higher A1C ranges, a greater improvement in the end A1C results. So what we had hoped for, getting that A1C reduced from 7.9 to 7.5, the use of the device in the 80% time period of auto mode was really a remarkable outcome for us. So now I do want to compare this to what we saw in the adolescents and adults. So combined, you can see their A1C curve on the left. Again, the black is the baseline. The gray is the shift to the left that we saw, and the improvement in the A1C for the adolescents and adults from 7.4 to 6.9. And then if we do the sensor overlay, so the adolescents and adults, this represents 12,000 days of patient exposure. Again, for the pediatric population, 7 to 13, 10,000 days of patient exposure in the orange. Behind that is the baseline period in the gray. And the data goes from midnight to midnight. And I hope you can appreciate that during the nighttime period, a reduction from midnight to the early morning time period till they wake up in the overall glucose pattern, a narrowing of glycemic variability, a mitigation of both hypo and hyperglycemia during the nighttime period. And then for the children, you see that big peak for breakfast, and then a little bit of variation for lunch, so the snacks that they take. You can see better in the adults, a peak of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In the adolescents, you see breakfast, lunch, then I don't stop eating till I go to bed. And I think what we appreciate with our children is that they do eat frequently during the daytime period. So we see that effect of the prandial rise in the glucose, but again, a narrowing compared to the baseline time period, and a particular mitigation in the children of hyperglycemia. So we can look at the data in tabular form as well. And now let me just first show you the adolescents and adults together. And we can look at the day and nighttime period, the full 24-hour time period together. And then we can separate out nighttime. So we're looking at 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. I think you can appreciate what we are really going for is an increase in time in range, 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. And I think you can see a nice increase both in the full 24-hour time period as well as the nighttime period, an even greater increase in time in range. How is that obtained? By decreasing both hypo and hyperglycemia. So this is, what we'd hope for. I think we're going to be talking more and more as we go forward about these glucometrics. Of course, in addition to these glucometrics, we can add standard deviation, we can add coefficient of variation, measures of glycemic variability, which also improved in our pivotal trial results for the adolescents and adults. So now going to the pediatric population. So the same tabular form of data analysis for our 7 to 13-year-olds. Again, the full 24-hour time period compared to nighttime alone. And now we see really the same magnitude of improvement, the same direction, obviously, of getting more time in range, less time in hypo and hyper. But the baseline is lower for time in range for our pediatric population, and there's a higher percentage of time at baseline in the hyperglycemic range. But we see again a significant change by using auto mode, our MiniMed 670G system, as a hybrid closed loop automation of insulin delivery device. So we see from 56 to 65% of the time in range from the baseline to the end of this through the study period. And again, now a reduction, particularly in the time in hyperglycemia. So almost 40% at baseline greater than 180, and we reduce that to 32%. And in the nighttime period from 38% to 26%. And most of that is now time in range increase for our patients. So we couldn't be more excited about these results, again, mirroring exactly what we saw in the adolescents and the adults, but at a lower baseline to start with. So I do want to share this slide with you. It's a little busy. It happens to be my favorite data analysis in that it shows exactly what is happening with hybrid closed loop. Essentially, we're taking the tremendous variability we see in glucose data and transferring that to have more variability in insulin delivery. If we look at multiple daily injections or open loop pump therapy, we really have a relatively narrow range of insulin delivery through basal insulin and a few peaks every time somebody eats or needs a correction. By comparison, now we see much more narrow glucose excursions compared to much more variability in insulin delivery. So if we look at the left side of this, again, the 14 to 75-year-olds, the adolescents and adults, compared to the 7 to 13-year-olds, we essentially see the same thing. So the top is the inner quartile range for the sensor glucose data over the study period, compared to the run-in period, which is in gray, the study period in orange. So the top values, we see a narrowing of glycemic variability through the nighttime period. And now we see that the orange band is greater than the gray band for the interquartile range of insulin delivery. So dynamic insulin delivery to narrow glycemic variability for both the adolescents and adults as well as the children. And if we now transfer that to a pie chart, we can look at the 14 to 75-year-olds and say that half of the time at night, they are either delivering the maximal amount of insulin that can be delivered as determined by the algorithm itself every 5 minutes, or no insulin at all. So we see for the adolescents and adults, about 20% of the time, they are delivering no insulin. 5 minutes here, 20 minutes over here, 15 minutes over there throughout the nighttime period, very variable. And then for about 32% of the time, they're delivering what we call Umax, the maximum amount of insulin that can be delivered by the algorithm itself. The rest of the 50% of the nighttime is everything in between the two. So we see a bar for 1 to 24%, 25 to 50%, and so on. Now, if we look at the same pie chart for the pediatric population, they are coming in more hyperglycemic. So for that 50% of the time period between Umax and no insulin delivery at all, we see more time in Umax, about 40% of the time, to mitigate that hyperglycemia that they're coming into the nighttime period with. And then we see about 15% of the time, no insulin delivery at all, and then the rest of the evening split between 1 to 24%, 25 to 49%, and so on. So variability now of insulin and much more narrow range for glycemic variability. Exactly what the device should be doing and actually doing it. It's easiest to see it at night when the disturbance of meal and bolus insulin is not quite as predominant. So I have to show you this slide, of course. For every study, there's certain limitations. This was a single-arm, non-randomized, pre-post design study. We had a lot of experience with this algorithm, eventually with the whole system through a series of feasibility studies. We had a great interaction ongoing with our FDA, and that enabled us to get to a study that was a pre-post design. Of course, this has obligated us to do a very large post-approval study, which we're about halfway enrolled in, a large outcome study involving 1,000 patients. They'll be in for a year time period. In the first 6 months will be a randomized portion of that study, either coming from MDI, half staying on MDI compared to our MiniMed 670G system, pump alone, or with pump and sensor compared to MiniMed 670G system. So we're really excited. Can't wait to have a webinar to show you the data from that very large study that, of course, will include the pediatric population in addition. So there's always inclusion-exclusion criteria in any clinical trial. How does that mean we can translate to the general population? I think we did have a relatively representative sample of children with type 1 diabetes in our study, so we do think that it will be translatable to the general commercial population as well. There are lots of study strengths in addition to the limitations. It was multi-center, it was a relatively large number of children. It was 3 months at home unsupervised, just like we would expect in the normal population using this device in the real world. We did confirm the sensor accuracy. We had a portion of the trial in which they were in a hotel setting for 5 nights and 6 days. One of those 24-hour time periods was used to compare the sensor data to a reference value, the iStat, and there was great correlation. And hopefully we are in the midst of getting, hopefully, our manuscript accepted, and it will be out in the public domain quite soon. But we do have a pediatric manuscript that's in the process of being published that will give the data on the sensor, our Guardian Sensor 3 itself, so you can be able to share that data with you, and you can also share that with your patients. But despite some of the limitations of any study, our study does have, I think, great data that shows that, first of all, the device is safe in the pediatric population. We had no severe hypoglycemia, no episodes of diabetic ketoacidosis in 10,000 days of patient exposure to the device. We had a pre-post, we had a run-in period in just open loop where we compared not only the effect on the A1C, which reduced to a mean of 7.5, but also the improvement in these glucometrics, improvement in time in range, decreased time in hyper and hypoglycemia, what the device is designed to do, and what we need to be able to do for our patients. So now it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Dr. Kevin Kaiserman. We had the opportunity to work together at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, and Kevin's going to share with you his experience as both an investigator as well as now using this commercially in his patient population.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufman. I am a pediatric endocrinologist practicing in Southern California, and I was privileged to be an investigator in the Pediatric Pivitol trial. I'm really happy to be here today to share with you some of the key learnings that we observe from the perspective of the healthcare professional, the parents, and the patients, as well as to share with you a couple of pediatric case studies from the Pivitol trial. Starting with the healthcare providers, the first thing is that we found that the system was much easier to learn than we might have anticipated going into the trial, with really a primary focus on optimizing the carbohydrate ratios for our patients. In addition, the use of the CareLink reports really helps in order to observe how patients are doing with the system and helps us to focus those key learnings and changes on the carbohydrate ratios. We recommend generally that patients are uploading the CareLink weekly to begin with as we make those initial changes, and after we make those first changes, there's often fewer changes as time goes on. When patients come back for follow-up, one of the things that we're trying to focus on is trying to have their manual mode settings reflect the current dosing that they are receiving when they are in the auto mode. The focus there is trying to look at the manual mode basal rate settings as well as the sensitivity to have them reflect the current dosing in auto mode, which is done by looking at the current total daily dose as well as the percentage of basal insulin that's being delivered. Another key learning from the aspect of the healthcare providers is looking at exercise and the way that we're managing exercise when using auto mode, with a focus on educating our patients about the use of the temp target, which is allowing the algorithm to shoot for a temporary target of 150 milligrams per deciliter rather than the standard target of 120 milligrams per deciliter. Just as a quick reminder, in the auto mode, the only settings that are being carried over from the manual mode that are being used in auto mode are the carbohydrate ratios and the active insulin time. The other settings, the basal rates, the sensitivity, and the target ranges, are not used by the algorithm when in auto mode. I'm really excited to share with you some of the key observations that I heard from parents and family members about using the MiniMed 670G system. One of the key things that I heard from patients was the reduced fear of hypoglycemia. We are all aware of the burden that hypoglycemia has in the management of people's diabetes, both in the acute and long term. The fear of hypoglycemia is a major driver in the decision-making that family members make, particularly going into bedtime and overnight. And this was dramatically reduced by using the MiniMed 670G system. As the trust in the system was increased over time, family members and patients were more likely to bolus appropriately for their meals and corrections, and this helped them to increase their time in target and reduce their glycemic variability with fewer highs and lows. The key learning and focus for the family members is to calibrate their glucose sensor as well as the appropriate bolusing for their carbohydrates prior to all meals and snacks. This led to an improved quality of life for all family members due to increased time sleeping, but also less focus on the day-to-day management of diabetes, with more trust in the 670G system to help improve the patient's overall diabetes care. So one of the most wonderful parts about using the MiniMed 670G system is seeing the responses of the patients. The things I heard and saw most frequently in our practice was that the patients themselves became much more independent in their diabetes management. This is a trial of 7 to 13-year-old children, and they are taking on much more of their own daily care and relying less on other adults to assist them when using the MiniMed 670G system. They've said that they felt better overall with more time in target, reduced variability, decreased frequency of high and low glucose values. The patient said that they found the system easier to use than they had expected, with greater comfort over the first several weeks of using the system. The key for the patients was focusing to see that they had the blue shield, indicating that they were in auto mode, and that they could then follow up with an adult if they had any questions if they were not in auto mode. But this was very easy for them to check throughout the day and see that they were generally maintaining time in auto mode and not requiring any additional intervention. Lastly, one of the things that the children would most commonly express to me is that they had fewer interruptions in their day-to-day activities due to fewer unexpected high and low glucose values. I do want to say again that the key behaviors that lead to success with the MiniMed 670G system is calibration of the sensor and entry of carbohydrates prior to all meals and snacks. Now let's take a look at a pediatric case study from the Pivitol trial. Jeff, who is a 12-year-old male who is quite tall for his age at 6 feet. He was wearing an Animus Ping insulin pump and Dexcom continuous glucose sensor prior to the trial. He is very active in competitive basketball, and he started on the MiniMed 670G system in May of 2016. We are going to focus on looking at the assessment and progress reports from CareLink to help make some key observations about how this patient did as he transitioned from using standard pump therapy to using the MiniMed 670G system with auto mode. This report is looking at the first week that this patient was in auto mode in blue compared to the prior week, his last week using the manual settings with the MiniMed 670G system without using automated basal delivery. That is in the orange color. If we focus down at the bottom, you will see on your lower right that this patient was already in auto mode 88% of the time in the very first week that he's using the therapy. Again, this shows you that the system can be very easy to learn and adapt to without requiring a lot of additional time or education. The other things to observe on this lower graph is that the patient is entering quite a few grams of carbohydrate, more than 400 grams per day. Again, this was during a part of the study where we were actually looking at a variety of different meals and exercise. So this patient was certainly eating lots of grams, but importantly, he was entering those grams into the system prior to eating. If you go to the lower left-hand side of this report, you see a graph that shows you percent time in target. And I think it's important to start thinking about time in range as another aspect of overall diabetes care, which is used in conjunction with hemoglobin A1C to look at overall control. So we know that A1C is an average of all of your glucose control, and now we're looking at time above, below, and within the target range. The target range in this report is looking at sensor glucose in the range of 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. And you can see that in the first week that this patient was using the MiniMed 670G system, he went from 32% in target to 65% of the time in target range. Another key aspect of this graph is time spent below target. And you can see that the patient is actually having fewer episodes of hypoglycemia, where his time below target has been reduced by using auto mode as well as his time above target. And if we move to the top aspect of this graph, you can see a couple of key observations. The first is the improved glycemic control overnight. So remember that this family is already using pump and sensor technology and making adjustments overnight, but often fear of hypoglycemia impacts people's decision-making about how to correct or how to bolus overnight. And you can see that the algorithm will adjust to that 120 target, and you see the improvement in the very first week with overnight glycemic control. This next slide shows us 3 months into auto mode. And I think that very excited to see that the improvements that we saw in the initial transition to auto mode are maintained, and additional improvement in glycemic control goes forward. You can see here that looking at the current time period, the patient is now in auto mode 99% of the time in this current time period. So not having exits from auto mode with any type of frequency at all. You can see that the patient continues to enter almost 400 grams of carbohydrate per day. You can see that his time in target is now increased to 82% of time in the target range. Again, the goal is to try to have at least 70% of time in target, and this patient is at 82% of time in target range. Now, one thing that you do want to note here on this current time period is that the percentage of low glucose values has gone up from the initial report that we looked at last time. You can see that he now has 4% of his values between 55 and 70 milligrams per deciliter. That's the red and white hashed area. And the solid red is 1%. The recommendation is to have not more than 1% in that 40 to 55 milligram per deciliter range, that is the solid red, and not more than 3% in the 55 to 70 milligram per deciliter range, which is the red and white hashed area. You can see that he's slightly above that recommendation on this graph. So you can focus on some of the reasons why patients might be experiencing increased frequency of low blood sugars. It can occur from patients putting in too many grams of carbohydrates for their meals or putting in grams that they are actually not eating. Another reason why you might see hypoglycemia and is actually the reason in this particular case is exercise. So as I mentioned at the outset, Jeff is very active in competitive basketball and plays for multiple hours every day. And so this is an opportunity to go back and talk about the use of the temporary target and any other strategies that you have in your clinical practice for helping the patient to manage hypoglycemia associated with exercise. If we go to the top part of this graph, what you see is dramatically reduced glycemic variability, really improved across the entire spectrum. If you see, there are not many changes if you focus in on the carbohydrate ratios, which is the primary focus that we change as we go forward with therapy. You can see that there's just a very minor change in the later afternoon with a reduction in the carbohydrate ratio from about 5 p.m. to midnight, from 12 grams per unit to 11 grams per unit. And you can see that some of that post-dinner and going into bedtime hyperglycemia has been reduced with that change. The next slide is looking at Jeff's experience when he's now been in auto mode for a period of about 7 months. And I want to make another couple of key observations. Again, he's maintaining his time in auto mode at 98% of the time. He's now eating quite a lot of carbohydrates. As an active teenager, you can see he's up to almost 700 grams of carbohydrate per day. With that being said, he's maintaining his time in target at 80% of the time. And if you focus underneath there, the red and white hashed, we've now reduced his frequency of hypoglycemia back into a safe range of 2% within the 55 to 70 milligram per deciliter range, with no time below 55 milligrams per deciliter. And if we go to the top, you see now that there are no changes to the carbohydrate ratios at the current time period compared to the previous time period. The key change here was that focus on education around how to use the temporary target for exercise. And you can see that the patient is now maintaining excellent overall glycemic control without having to make additional changes to his settings. So let me just summarize a couple of things about Jeff's experience in the trial. So the first thing is that he is one of those individuals who was able to experience much more independence in his diabetes care while maintaining all of his vigorous activity, active in competitive basketball, and as we mentioned several times, eating quite a few grams of carbohydrate. The other thing is that Jeff's parents would absolutely tell you that they have had much better overall control of their own experience with diabetes, less time up overnight checking. Jeff's mother was typically up at least 2 times every night checking his glucose prior to this therapy, and since using the MiniMed 670G system, she is able to sleep completely through the night, which she says has helped in all aspects of her life, making her a better parent to her other kids, to her spouse, and most importantly, to herself. So with that being said, I just want to say a couple things about the A1C control for Jeff before and throughout the trial. And again, he continues to be in what's considered the continued access phase of the trial. So he is still continuing on to be observed through his use of the MiniMed 670G system. Prior to starting the therapy, his A1C was 7.7 when he first came into the trial and 7.8 immediately before starting into the auto mode. You can see at the end of the study, his A1C had dropped to 6.6%. Then we showed you again the care link that was from December, where he had very few episodes of hypoglycemia with an A1C maintained at 6.7%. In March of 2017, about a year after starting on the therapy, his A1C was 6.9%. And just recently, in April of this year, 2 years after starting on the therapy, his A1C is maintained well within the recommended target of 6.7%. We've been extremely happy with the 670G system in our clinical practice as well as the research trials. We see patients experiencing more time in range, fewer high and low glucose values, improved overnight control in particular, with decreased fear of hypoglycemia, leading to more appropriate bolus dosing for food and corrections. Patients consistently report to us that they feel better than they've ever felt before living with diabetes. They appreciate the increased independence that they have in managing their diabetes. Patients report that the system has been easier to use than they had expected. My patients have really appreciated the opportunity to experience the MiniMed 670G system in auto mode. We really look forward to continued innovation and continuing to close the loop and improving the lives of all people living with type 1 diabetes. I hope that this has been helpful to review these cases, and I wish you and your patients great success as they transition to using the MiniMed 670G system.